Basically, no, it's going to be wetter in Wales, Western Scotland.
Well,
hello.
Hello.
I am your on-call idiot for the afternoon who cannot make a judgment between time zones. So deep apologies if people have been kicking their heels and waiting for the idiot to appear. Thank you for bearing with me as you obviously have done. Just letting a couple more people in the room.
Thank you for appearing.
What you didn't see just prior to that appearance was massive. Take the work laptop off because the work laptop won't run Zoom. Put the new one on, and I was looking at messages, and my phone rang, and messages were coming in. I thought, I wonder if it's possible just to crawl up in a sort of embryo state and pretend this hasn't happened. But nevertheless, we're here now. I may have lost a few people en route, but I'll have to take my whacks for that. So we've now got not very long, 45 minutes to talk about urban design and built environment and what that might mean for us as OD practitioners. So shall I just kick off? And I was going to use Menti, but we'll give up on that now. It's a small enough group, just have a bit of a conversation about it. People are content with that? Should we just see where it takes us?
Yeah.
More people appearing. Fantastic. Let's do this thing. Let's fly by the seat of our pants. Okay. Let me share my screen. So I wanted to talk a bit about sidewalks today, because when the topic of community came up for ODNE this year, I began to think, oh, this is really interesting, because it goes to some points I've been kicking around in my head about what does community mean? You know, we hear the term used in quite a lot of contexts. It gets regularly used in what I consider to be quite a loose fashion. So we talk about it in generalized terms, but sometimes there's a bit of a slippage about what does it mean. And certainly that sense of community as a locality or a neighborhood tends not to appear as much. So I picked up in terms of some of the reading around this that there is such a thing as a brand community, which means if you like a particular brand that you can get in a store somewhere, then you become part of a community in that sense. I'm not altogether convinced on that part. I think it's a convenient shorthand for something else, but nevertheless, it's there. So it seemed like the term was getting drained of quite a lot of what actually it has inside its heart. And this came through my door the other day, because of course it's polling day very shortly, and it's a Labour leaflet. Interestingly, the Tory leaflet features a consultant surgeon, and you know he's a consultant surgeon because in every election address he appears in scrubs with a face mask on. So just in case there's any confusion about that. But here we get this term being used around supporting our communities without much specification about what that means in practice. And then something about labour in the community, whatever that might mean. But again, it's carrying some sort of message, but sometimes it's a little difficult to fathom what is being carried in there. So this is where I started. I was thinking, well, what does this term community mean? Hello, Sarah. I've scrabbled about like a maniac, and I'd like to say it was swan like, but it wasn't, because there was both furious activity on the surface and below the surface. But yeah, I'm here. Sorry.
I'm gonna leave you then.
Okay. If there's anyone else kicking around who was meant to be here, feel free to show them in. Thank you. So community as a term seems a little slack from my perspective. And then there's this secondary element, which is, and this is an article from 1986, so it's got a bit of age to it. It's clear that community is powerful, as a term. It's used in lots of ways, but equally, it's not necessarily automatically good. So the examples there are very, very important. I went past a gated community the other day where I thought, well, that's extremely interesting because I haven't seen anything like that for a long, long time. But it clearly a tiny little space, a little bit of land, had been knocked into what they called a community, which is really a cluster of houses and a gate put on it. So there's a sense, particularly as Macmillan and Chavez talk about, that community can drive people together. It can also be polarizing and separating. So it's a term that has a certain elasticity, I think, when we start to think of it in a social context, and as a result in an organizational context as well. We need to understand that, I think, and we need to engage with the term critically rather than unthinkingly. This is my hometown. It's Welwyn Garden City. I don't know if anyone recognises it. when I first moved here, as I walked along those stretches, I could almost see the planner's ruler on a draftsman's table drawing this stretch of land. It's all very pleasant and very green and very charming, but it is very, very heavily designed. And I start with this not just because I live in the town, but because in the work of Jane Jacobs, which I'm trying to pivot this session around, she really tears Ebenezer Howard, the originator of the Garden City concept, off a strip for trying to create something desperately artificial, something that actually is not anything like a community, is not meaningful, it is creating false separations and is not building a lively space in which human beings might interact and work together successfully. So whilst that's a very pretty vista, term boulevard might be applied, I suppose, it also has this sense from perspective of Jane Jacobs that it's a quite negative thing, and it doesn't reflect the way in which she thinks about cities in general and what she sees as a vibrancy in terms of cities. So that's a lovely picture. And the Garden City concept does carry with it this idea of, very, very green, low level, weird separations of function, which is probably one of its defining elements. So that's an early diagram of the town plan, which is conveniently coded to the top left legend around residential spaces are here, factories are here, open spaces and woods are here, and public buildings and shops, etc. are elsewhere. And so that is the notion of Garden City, and that is the notion that Jane Jacobs takes as a real challenge around community. That if a community is to mean anything, those kind of various elements of urban living need to fold in on one another and to be quite closely linked and related. So that's one of the elements that starts us off today, the thinking about a certain level of artificiality where people are constructing community, or where the term community is being applied in a slightly loose fashion, and the way in which community might genuinely manifest itself and how we might have experienced that. So I'm just going to pause and stop sharing and give people a bit of an opportunity just to share what their experience of community in terms of that locality has been historically, perhaps has been over the past 12 months, because that's a slightly more critical period. So if everyone has any observations as we think about community as a local thing, what would you make an observation about? What would you say?
Mark, when you called this sidewalks, I was really struck by the clap for carers, and I know there's a whole load of controversy around that, but in my street, I hadn't lived here for very long. I'd only been here for a few months, and clap for carers got everybody out in the street, and we were all like socially distanced, but we were all there out on the sidewalks, out on the pavements, all talking to one another. And the interesting thing to me now is I'm noticing that I talk to these I'd lived in my previous house 6 or 7 years, barely spoke to the neighbours, but the ones here I speak to a lot. And there's something about that shared sidewalk emotional experience that created a different neighbourhood community feeling for me.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Judy. That's fantastic. And thank you for finding your way in after I messed up the timing so badly.
I left as soon as I heard that you'd got started. I left and came here. Just get rude of me.
Well, that's like an open space, isn't it? It's the law of
Yeah.
2 feet. You just go wherever. Okay. And hello, Phoebe. I've just seen you. Any other observations? That's a really helpful kickstart, I think, Judy. Thank you. Any other observations about community?
Yeah, so I live in a really rural place, and I think there's some similarities in what Julie shared, but it wasn't around the clap for carers. It's just that people are going out and walking, and we have got quite a busy road that goes through the village, so you bump into people on the sidewalks, the pavements. And I've stopped and talked to people that I'd never met before, that it's just built in a lot of connections that weren't there before, really strong. And thinking about it in terms of what else has been created to build that community, it's technology. It's been using WhatsApp and setting up groups and ways to connect with people. And local communities have used the technology to connect, because we don't have the shops and the pub and the things that people come and form around. So it's the things that weren't designed in, that closed because there wasn't enough trade for it, that now technology is coming in and replacing. So it's not been designed in, it's been created by the community. Which looking at that against a Welling Garden City and the Garden City movement, yeah, makes me really, really thoughtful how different it is in rural areas as well compared to urban areas.
And probably also a difference in terms of middle class and not middle class. So my world is very middle class in that sense, in terms of where I live, but also the things I'm doing and who I'm connecting with. So I'm so struck by that, and it'd be lovely to hear Phoebe what Phoebe's thoughts are in terms of living in Asia. Yeah, we've created community by developing a community forest garden in an allotment area, and that has been a very different experience of connecting with people who the ecology and the natural world matters.
Yeah. Thank you, Rick. It's Phoebe, were you about to speak? I can see you've just unmasked.
Yeah, and don't get into trouble. You have to take yourself off mute.
Yeah, don't take your mask off and then don't unmute yourself.
No, I'm on the way. I just I didn't notice that you started the session, because I tried to connect and I was just keeping it open, and then in between I realized, so I just parked somewhere. So I was just noticing that, being in the Middle East and where I live, it is more of a like a tower structure, and the communities are mostly confined to their homes. And actually, COVID actually made it a bit difficult to interact. And probably being in an expat environment, this becomes a bit more challenging, because culturally diverse communities in the same flats, like we have Arabic speaking population or other nationalities. Sometimes language act as a barrier.
Yeah.
And that actually creates challenges in community conversations most of the time.
Thank you. I think that's an important reinforcement of kind of cultural differences around community. So certainly, I think I've said before, when COVID hit, I counted my blessings in a whole range of ways, but one of them was that I lived in a house that had a garden, and that it was a garden city, so I could walk within 10 minutes to a nature reserve. I could take my 7-year-old to the woods. It suddenly had a huge benefit in terms of being in contact with nature. And I remember thinking, as the disease kind of ran through Italy, and particularly as you hit Spain, really hard, and they were talking about Barcelona, and thinking about my experience in Barcelona as lots of apartment blocks, lots of people living in apartments. That was suddenly thinking, Christ, how would you endure lockdown if you were with your family in a space like that and very little kind of communal area? I think there are a number of things in there which I'd really like to pick up on. I think the walking thing that Rachel mentioned is probably one of the big benefits. You know, if you're looking for silver linings from COVID, and I try to, despite my generally quite Eeyore type disposition. If you're looking for the positive, it is that walking. It is going out again. I don't actually just walk from the front door downstairs to a car over in the bay over there. I start now to walk. I should do more walking, but I do walk as much as I can. And in doing that walking, you do bump into people, and it is interesting that people are slightly more content to have those kind of passing conversations, which are invariably so powerful in terms of making it. Weirdly, it feels like you're making a strong emotional connection with that individual, even though it's just a fleeting experience. And I remember talking to a general practitioner, and I was talking, I said to him, well, where do you get most of your professional development from? Thinking he'd say, oh, I do courses or whatever. And he said, well, if I come out of my office and pass a colleague in the corridor, I might say, oh, I've just seen Mrs. Jones, and she's got this lump on the back of the head, and it looks a bit like this, and it might look like this. And the colleague would say, oh, it might be so-and-so, and then they would just go. But in the course of that momentary exchange, so much had passed between them, and so much learning or potential learning had taken place. So I think the walking is vitally important. But as we've also said, the technology has created a greater sense of communication. I think sometimes connection is a slightly grand word for it, because I'm looking forward to my second jab, because I need to see people other than just these tiles, which is lovely because I get to see you. But there's something yearning inside of me when I see people like this, and I'm thinking, oh yeah, that connection where you might just sit down and just have an exchange and maybe have a drink and then go your separate ways. That seems very powerful. And I think shops and pubs have stopped being those social hubs, if indeed they ever were. It was interesting. I was pushed into John Lewis at the weekend as part of my overall recovery from a deep sense of anxiety over the past 12 months. I think my wife thinks that kind of shock treatment is the best way of approaching it. I'm not sure what other clinicians might take a similar view, but I was very struck about how atomized that shopping experience actually feels. And it may be a contrast now, because what we've had is the walking and the talking, and suddenly you're thrown back into commerce where you're just kind of wandering around looking at stuff. And I don't think I had an exchange with anyone in John Lewis in the same way as I would do if I was walking in my neighborhood and chat to them. And just picking up on Rianne's stuff about community forest garden, I think that's another interesting development, how people have clubbed together in a whole range of ways. So I think the real power of all the mutual aid stuff that we've seen. So within Welwyn Garden City, a whole range of kind of both virtual and actual organisations that connect people and offer services and really provide support. That strikes me as fantastically powerful as well. So let me go back, and I think that's really helpful. Thank you for sharing those observations. And it does, of course, thankfully chime with where I was headed with this, which was to say, I can make it advance. So this is the observation somebody called Paul Goodman, who people may be aware was a kind of sometimes gets talked about as the philosopher of the New Left. And he made some interesting observations about planned communities, but it wasn't an integrated town. So the result is what he described as suburbs and garden cities, just as dormitories, with a culture centering around small children, which from my perspective is not a bad thing, but And such plans, so-called shopping centres, were actually disrupting others as well. And finally made a kind of observation about cars being quite distorting. It is interesting in a garden city like Welling, the amount of car usage there is, and the council have been quite busily trying to put up a 2 or 3 story multi-story car park by the library, which seemed very peculiar because we're trying to get people to walk more. So there's clearly an issue here, and we've kind of touched on it, I think, in that conversation we just had. And then with the new town, I mean, this is, I can't remember which new town this actually was. It's Lefebvre talking about France. But here, that kind of upward build, which Phoebe was talking to us about, doesn't have much of a sense of community about it. And people can exist in those settings without ever kind of bumping into one another necessarily. So I think that there's something in that as well about just putting people together in a fairly limited space at a high level of density does not create community in the way we've just described. And similarly, this is a town called Wolfsburg, which is virtually VW town, so it's a company town. You tend not to see them so much these days. You see them in the kind of Victorian industrial things. You see towns like Saltaire and others in this country. But here, this is still the major production site for VW in Germany, and virtually everything is driven by VW's presence. So despite people coming together, despite people being present, that doesn't in and of itself necessarily create community. And there is a very, very good article that I've referenced at the bottom from a recent edition of Human Relations that talks about people's experience of living in that kind of town. So despite all the best efforts of landscaping, waterways, it's an industrial view, but it's nevertheless, there's an attempt at planning out something that's got slightly more human feel. Quite a lot of negativity from people about just the sheer control and cultural overlay that VW as an organization kind of applied to a situation like a company town. Now, here's the hero of the piece. This is Jane Jacobs in the middle, who was both a writer and activist, not trained architect necessarily, but very powerfully motivated by the ideas of the city. And her fabulous book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, talks very particularly, as I said, with an opening critique of the Garden City movement, and goes on to talk very, very poetically in many ways about what she considers to be critical elements of the city as a living, organic space where great things happen. And she does, in one section, describe this sidewalk ballet, which starts with her at 8 o'clock taking out her trash can, and talks a lot about just the ebb and flow of people in a limited space, and that space being constructed out of multiple elements, so shops and residences and a little bit of factory work. It's just a mix, a melange of things going on, and it is that space and the free movement of people in that space and their connection that creates a number of things, including a deep sense of safety. So she makes the observation that the sidewalk is a kind of liminal space where people will come and go, and they will go into shops and they might meet people. But more importantly, because of that coming and going, people are more likely to look out their windows or sit on their stoop, and thereby secure the safety of the space. So if you have traffic on a sidewalk, then you have people likely to want to watch the traffic, and in watching the traffic, they are likely to add to a sense of security, which draws more people in. So that's why Jane Jacobs talks very much about that organic quality to cities, and what's so vitally important is the circulation of human beings and the way in which human beings react to that circulation. So for her, in contrast to the picture of the boulevard I showed in terms of Welling Garden City, this for Jane Jacobs is a rich city space where it will be more meaningful to talk about community because people will connect more. And they don't need to be intimately connected. They don't need to know each other brilliantly well. They don't even have to know each other's names, but they need to be a nodding acquaintance, and they need to be looking out for one another. And there needs to be free movement in that sense. So this is directly from Death and Life of Great American Cities. It's talking specifically about the safety of the streets and the freedom of the city. It's the intricacy of sidewalk use, because of the succession of eyes, and it's all composed of movement and change. And she talks about it, as I say, as a dance or a ballet, not for simple-minded precision dance with everyone kicking at the same time, but to an intricate ballet, a ballet that's different pretty much in every street, but nevertheless has the same impact. So she talks about safety through active and constant circulation and connection. She talks about contact and exchange at various points in the landscape, which we've identified, particularly post-COVID or during COVID, as being critical. And she identifies stuff like routine, familiarity, unforced diversity. So the spaces have a diverse quality in terms of different styles of usage, different types of people moving in and out, and just the importance of traffic. I just thought this was mildly amusing, but that probably describes me just being a bit of a dweeb, a bit of a stats dweeb. But because it said sidewalk, I thought I'm putting that in the presentation. It's too good to miss. Now, this is the wonderful Mindy Fullilove, who writes extensively about social psychiatry. So she's a psychiatrist by training, and is very powerfully engaged with thinking about the built environment. So in this particular article called Root Shock, she talks about a particular community that lived together for generations and had strong ties. And the richness here is the dependencies that people had. So there were social, religious, and political organizations. There was an array of businesses. There was a pharmacy, a corner grocery store, and an undertaker. All human life and death were represented in that space. And the importance of the community to its members was heightened by the second-class citizenship its members endured in the rest of the city. So it was a large African-American community. And Fullilove's work talks about how the plans for urban renewal in the United States, the literal sense that these are ghettos or slums and they need to be knocked down, and we need to move population out into projects, seemed to be well motivated from an urban design perspective. It seemed like it was trying to offer people better housing stock. But Fullilove argues that actually it destroyed those communities, destroyed the way in which they were building high levels of capital, not just financial capital, but cultural capital, in terms of strengthening their links with the wider political situation and building a civil society. And once you put people out into projects, they lost that sense of connection, they lost that sense of community, and in actual fact, projects became less attentive to the needs of the people there and ended up quite unpleasant places in which to live to a large extent. So I was just going to pause for a bit. It will probably take us to time just to ask this question. So if we're thinking about this physical notion of community and the way in which I've described this urbanized notion of community with its positives and negatives, is there any resonance in terms of what we think about in respect to our work? So can the workplace context be conceived of as a locality? And how might this idea of the sidewalk have an application in organisational work? So I'll pause and let's have a conversation about
that. I'd like to offer a few thoughts.
Of course.
I did live in Welwyn Garden City.
Ah, okay.
And I worked in work study, which at that time meant that I went out with all the workmen, whether they were refuse. I did that 2 weeks after my honeymoon, or parksmen or whatever. So I actually got to know the city in a very different way than I suspect that you know it, Mark.
Yeah.
So that's almost like an informal getting to know a city. I now live in a very rural area, and actually the likes of Facebook and dog walking, we don't have a dog, all manner of things actually, and actually the bringing together, because we might be getting broadband, that sort of thing has brought people together in what is a very, very dispersed community. So it's meant that the likes of me have gone out to people that I have never spoken with before, deliberately to sign them up to broadband, because we live or die by the village as a whole signing up, sufficient of us. And some, it's dispersed, you know, there's 150 people spread over 3 miles.
It's a lot of walking.
Yeah. You can use a car as well, actually, Alistair. I have got to know paths and lanes and houses and people that I wouldn't have done otherwise. I'm going to say in this area, the likes of Tesco's and Waitrose and the post office and the library mean that people do interact, but it's all on a very informal. It's how I get to hear of funerals of people I know from the gym, or funerals of people I've known from the church. Even though I don't still go to it, I'm part of a network. In my OD work pre-COVID, a lot of my work was done by what I would call wandering around water cooler OD. I don't do massive facilitations. I have minimal facilitations, which is contrary to, I know, to some of you others on this thing, but my OD has always been by wandering and sensing what's going on in this part of the building, that part of the building. So the design layout of an organization and their building has been hugely important to how I've worked. Now, virtually, it doesn't quite work the same way. But actually, maybe perversely, I've been busier this year purely and simply by connecting with people on the screen.
Yeah.
I've seen all of you before, including Phoebe. I have seen all of you before. So I have got some context of you. I'm sensing the situation as well as you as individuals. So it's not materially altering my OD as such.
Thank you. Ria, what were you?
Well, thank you. I was just struck, Maureen, by your reflections about Welwyn Garden City, and just I remember hearing about Westminster City Council, and so many of the staff don't live in Westminster at all, of course. So they've really spent time within their organisation to connect and understand the journeys that people make in order to come into the city, and use that to understand better what the services are that are required of those who use the city streets. So that's sort of an interesting thing about the environment and the work, or the workplace, that just comes to mind.
I've done a couple of regeneration large group things, and in both of them, one of the things that we did is we had people walk out, taken out to parts of the city, and then they all walked in, taking different routes, and talked about what they noticed about the area that they walked through as a precursor to thinking about regeneration. And I spent the weekend in Chester, just needed to get out of these four walls and see some more. And Chester's, I love Lincoln, Chester, the medieval walled York, the medieval walled city is just a delight. And there's something about the messiness of all those years of kind of like putting things together in a undesigned way. And some of the worst bits of those medieval cities are the 1960s, oh, let's design it all to be more efficient bits of the city. And I was kind of like thinking, oh, could I use the visit to Chester as a metaphor for And one of the things David and I always do when we go to a city like that is we don't go in the shops, but we do like to walk the back streets.
Yeah.
So I thought, that's an interesting metaphor for our work in organisations. Do we walk the back streets of organisational life? Canals are a great way to get, a different angle on the city and see it from, and do we try those different angles, those different walks through our organisations? That's
Julie, I love that. I love walking. I'm nicking that because I just love that notion of back streets of organisational life, because I think it's such a powerful metaphor, and it just reminds us where so much is going on. So, from my perspective in my work, I very often feel that some of my activity I end up just suspended just below a managerial level, doing the work of that managerial level. And so I'm skating a surface. But to go to Maureen's point, it's absolutely essential to recognize that underneath that surface, stuff is going on. And the stuff that's going on is the business of the business very often. And I sometimes talk to NHS organizations where I say, sketch out your organogram, tell me who's in what position. And then I said, well, okay, tell me how the work gets done. What happens underneath that structure to say how this work gets done? Brilliant, I think that's really powerful. And I think the messiness is really important. And I think, to think about those medieval towns, it is palimpsestry. They build upon build upon build. They never quite completely efface the past, but something appears on top of it or alongside it.
Medieval cathedrals are a mix of at least 10 architectural periods.
They are. They're beautiful. And I was listening to somebody talking about Soho in central London today, and he had lived in Soho, and he said there was one particular alley that he would never go down because it was just too dark and too dingy, and he just thought it was slightly too menacing. And of course, these days, Soho is remade, and he said he walked past that little space the other day, and there was a very brightly lit coffee shop down it now. And I was just thinking about that city example. I think there are two things for me that come out of psychogeography, which I find really interesting. I've never done them because I think it's probably something I should have done when I was younger. It's not something you're going to inflict on the family. But one of the arguments is if you were to visit Paris or visit a large city you've never visited before, you should try and navigate it using a map of a different city. Now that sounds crazy, but what it does is to generate a kind of a perturbation, a sense of I don't know what I'm doing here, and what does this map tell me, and does it tell me anything about this city? And suddenly you're looking at the city in a slightly different way. And the other practice they were recommending was that when you go to Paris and you see the Eiffel Tower, you think, right, I'm going to take a picture of the Eiffel Tower because everyone in the world going to Paris takes a picture of the Eiffel Tower. And the argument was actually turn your back to the Eiffel Tower and take the picture in the opposite direction, because suddenly you're getting a more complex perspective. So I think there is something about organizations as accretions of things, layer upon layer of stuff. And certainly my view is my responsibility is to get underneath that as best I can, because you want to hear the voices that Maureen was hearing. You want to see the things that make the business work, and that is not what you're necessarily going to see in some sort of not that we use hotel rooms anymore with cabaret style layout, whatever. But that's the bit you need.
In a walled city, the other thing that's worth doing is walking the walls, because you get a bit of a sense of the shape of the city. So if we could walk the walls of our organizations and the back streets, we might get a sense of its shape.
Oh, Julie, you're on fire today. This is brilliant.
Well, Chester's one of those places. It's so beautiful and interesting.
I have a terrible confession about walled cities. I chose to go to York University when I was in my mid-20s because I liked York. That's all that informed my view of it. I've been to holiday a couple of times up there. By the end of the 3 years, I hated the place.
Yeah, I bet.
Because it was like a Disneyfied chocolate box top. And then I went and did my teacher training in Bolton. And I loved
Oh yeah. Bolton.
because, again, interestingly, you'd get on the bus to go into Bolton Town Centre and people would talk to you.
Yeah.
It's a bit like when I first went to Nottingham, the bus driver outside the station said, "That'll be £1.80, love." I thought, oh, he just called me love. And apparently it's perfectly normal in Nottingham, along with me duck and such. Okay, I'm conscious of time. I'm conscious of the late start and the time. And I've just seen that Steve Hearson is in the waiting room. So shall I let him in, or shall we be a mean community and leave him out? I'll let him in. I've really enjoyed that 45 minutes. It was quite intensive, and I'm really sorry I just paused up the time and just didn't understand time zones.
I sent you a message because I suddenly thought, I know what he's done. He's not realised it, because I made that mistake. So I just suddenly thought, oh, I wonder if that's what it is. That's why I sent you a message.
That's very kind, because I then quickly called up Sarah's email and looked and said, it said 3:15 CST, and I thought, oh, that's not this time. That's European time.
You won't be the first or the last,
No,
Mark.
no, absolutely, you won't.
No,
A lot of Brits are going to do the same.
Because we're used to it being in our time zone.
Yes, exactly.
You can alter the agenda. There is a button you can click on the agenda to make it go to your time zone. I strongly recommend it, because then you can get better oriented.
God, I wish I'd known that before. Thank you. It's been so lovely to talk to you all. Thank you. And thank you for making time to come together.
Mark. This lived up to its promise in terms of stimulating some nice thinking. So thank you very much. It's been very good.
And actually, doing it in this way meant I suddenly worried less. I worried less about what I thought I needed to come. I tore up the plan and ran away.
Busking is always better.
Busking is good, yeah. Absolutely.
Which is another thing you get on city sidewalks.
That is true, actually, the buster. Yeah, absolutely true.
Outside our apartment in Chester, every day there was a different one. It was great.
Excellent. Okay, bye everybody. You're probably off to tea in another session. Lovely to meet you.
Hi, Stephen. Bye.
Yeah, he came in and now he's here, but he's lurking. Where are you?
I was obviously got my timing wrong as well.
We've got to go to close now.
I've been juggling dogs this afternoon and clients, so I've just got my diary totally wrong. I thought I had it right.
I'd pay a lot of money to watch a man juggling dogs.
Even if it's Steve.
Particularly if it's Steve. I think he's got the chutzpah to carry it off.
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to put you on to Britain's Got Talent when they next recruit. I'm going to say my friend Steve can juggle dogs.
No, but I just do it in an OD way, which probably means involving some kind of reflective practice.
Yeah, it's gonna take that'll be the curse of it, as they might say.
Right, it's very close. See you later.
Anyway,
okay, bye, Rachel.
Is it this Friday I'm talking to you, or next week?
It's this Friday, I think, or is it now? I can't remember. It's so confusing. Yeah. Living life on Zoom is just too confusing.
Well, we know it's UK time anyway.
Yeah, thank goodness. I was sitting here working, and suddenly messages started popping up, and messages started popping up, and things were happening. I was thinking, what's going on? I thought, oh shit!
How I totally cocked up at the time though. I thought I'd got it absolutely right, but clearly not. Oh, well.
No, it's you and me. It's probably my fault because I'd set up the Zoom meeting for 3:15 British summertime. So it's probably my fault. Well.
I'm sure it was brilliant. See you, Phoebe.
See you, Mark. See you, Steve. Catch up later.
Okay.
Good to see you again. You okay? We didn't get a chance to just do the best.
I reached home on the drive.
That's excellent. Perfect. That's multitasking for you.
Yeah, so I was seeing the sidewalks all the way.
Oh, that's an immersive experience. That's very cool. Yeah, okay, that's a lived experience.
But what I realized is, like in these cities like Dubai, there are huge focus on landmarks to be created, and it actually trickles down to the work culture also. That is focused on tallest, broadest, on the length of what we see rather than what is inside at times.
Yeah, yeah, it is all that kind of outward look at this. It's a spectacle. It doesn't tell you about the practical, which is an interesting contrast, I think.
Yeah.
See you.
Okay, bye, Vivi. You're right, Mr. Hearson. You look a bit phased. I just thought I'd better check in.
No, I've got. I'm into month 4 of very early starts walking the dog.
Oh right, okay.
It's like having a second child, which is lovely. You know, I've done more walking in the last 3 weeks as he's got bigger than I have done ever, which is great.
Yeah.
You know, brilliant for my health. But just every so often, I find myself really flagging. Really flagging. And did you? Were you there for Peter Block's session?
No, I haven't been able to join anything. So I kind of put the 3 days out. I blocked them out.
You're still recording, by the way.
Oh yeah, good job. I've been discreet and polite.